The phone rang at the Fallbrook police station. Officer Grayson answered. There was silence. Then a small voice whispered, "It hurts, and I'm not supposed to tell." She was just 6, alone at home, covered in red marks. No one knew what was causing them. But that call, that quiet, trembling voice, would lead a blind dog to uncover a hidden danger and help a broken family find their way back to trust, hope, and healing. The rain had returned to Fallbrook like an old song, soft at first, then steady, then all-consuming. It washed the dust from the faded signs above closed storefronts and turned the dirt roads into quiet ribbons of mud. It was the first rain of the season, early autumn, and the gray skies above the Iowa fields seemed lower than usual, pressing gently against the town below. Inside the small police station that sat 2 blocks from the corn silos, the lights buzzed faintly. Officer Daniel Grayson leaned back in his creaking chair, rubbing the back of his neck with one hand, while the other rested near a lukewarm cup of coffee. The morning had been slow. Most mornings in Fallbrook were. He welcomed that. Daniel was 42, broad-shouldered, with graying brown hair and eyes that seemed both sharp and tired. A man built like a doorframe, always standing tall but with a weariness that clung to his bones. His face bore the calm of a man who'd lived through more than he spoke about. A scar traced the edge of his left jaw, the only visible remnant of his military years. Now, as the town's police chief, he lived a life quieter than the one he'd once imagined. At his feet, resting near the space heater, was Rusty. Rusty was no ordinary dog. A 7-year-old German shepherd with sable fur and a dignified posture, he bore the soft, worn look of experience. Once a proud K9 partner, Rusty had been blinded in a warehouse explosion 2 years ago. His eyes now lay hidden beneath a clean white blindfold, knotted gently at the back of his head. He could no longer see, but he moved with the grace of memory and instinct, his ears alert, his head often turned toward sounds the human ear barely noticed. Daniel glanced at the dog, who stirred slightly at the thunder's distant murmur. "You still hear storms before I do," Daniel muttered, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Rusty's tail thumped once against the floor. The momentary stillness was broken by the shrill ring of the emergency line. Daniel sat upright, the muscles in his back stiffening out of habit. He grabbed the receiver. Fallbrook PD Officer Grayson. There was silence, only the faint sound of breathing. Daniel leaned forward. "Hello? Can you speak?" A small voice finally came through. It was barely a whisper. It won't stop itching." Daniel froze. "Sweetheart, who is this?" A pause. Emily Carter." Daniel's brow furrowed. He knew that name. Melissa Carter's daughter. They lived out past the old grain elevator on Larch Road. He had seen the girl once or twice. Thin frame, big eyes, always clutching a book or her mother's hand. He softened his tone. "Emily, are you home alone?" Another pause. "Mommy's at work." "And your dad?" "Gone. I don't know." Daniel straightened. Something about the way she spoke, so careful, so scared, tugged at something in him. "Can you tell me what's wrong? Why does it itch?" There was a long silence. Then, "My arms, my neck, my tummy. There's red spots. I tried not to scratch." Her voice dropped lower. "But Daddy says I shouldn't talk about it, or call anyone." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. "Emily, you did the right thing calling me. I'm going to come check on you, okay?" Suddenly the voice turned rushed, frightened. "Someone's coming. I have to go." And the line went dead. Daniel set the phone down slowly, staring at it. He didn't move for a moment, but his thoughts were already racing. Rusty had risen to his feet, sensing the shift in his partner's body. Daniel grabbed his coat and keys. "We're heading out," he said. Rusty padded beside him without hesitation. But, just as they reached the front door, another voice called out behind them. "Where are you going?" Daniel turned to see a lanky teenager standing in the hallway, holding a cereal bowl in one hand, hoodie sleeves pulled over both fists. His brown hair hung low over one eye, and his expression was guarded but curious. Josh Grayson, 17, Daniel's son, though these days they felt more like roommates than family. Josh had been staying with Daniel for the past month after getting into trouble back in Des Moines, a school fight, an expulsion, and a silence that had stretched for years until it shattered. Now he was here, mostly quiet, mostly distant. Living under the same roof, but behind emotional walls neither of them quite knew how to lower. Daniel didn't stop moving. Got a welfare check, a little girl called, might be sick. Josh frowned. In this weather? Daniel paused at the door. I don't like the sound of her voice. Josh gave a small shrug. You always say that. Daniel didn't answer. He opened the door and let the rain hit his face for the first time that morning. Rusty stepped out beside him, head lifted slightly as if mapping the sound of the falling rain in his mind. Josh watched them go, his eyes lingering not on his father, but on the blindfolded dog who moved forward like he could still see everything that mattered. The rain hadn't let up since morning, and by late afternoon, the town of Fallbrook looked as though it had been glazed in silver. Droplets streamed down every window pane, traced the rusted mailbox at the Carter house, and dripped quietly off the edge of the porch roof. The air was thick with the scent of wet soil and old wood, and everything around the little blue house on Larch Road seemed to hold its breath. Officer Daniel Grayson stood on the front porch, his coat damp from the drive, the brim of his hat slick with rain. Beside him, Rusty sat still, his ears alert, his body steady. The blindfold wrapped gently around the dog's head fluttered slightly in the wind, white against the dark of his sable coat. When the door creaked open, it wasn't with welcome. It was caution that peered out. Emily Carter stood there in a threadbare sweatshirt, the sleeves far too long for her 6-year-old arms. Her pale face peeked through damp strands of blonde hair, and her legs trembled slightly where she stood barefoot on the worn floor. Daniel offered a soft smile. Hi there, Emily. Remember me? She nodded slowly. Her voice was barely audible. You brought the dog. That's right, Daniel said gently. This is Rusty. She opened the door wider. He can't see, right? Daniel stepped inside, Rusty following close behind. No, but he sees in his own way, with his nose, his ears, even his heart. Emily looked down at the dog as he passed, a flicker of comfort in her gray eyes. The inside of the house was modest, clean in a hurried sort of way, like someone had done their best with not enough time. A laundry basket half filled with clothes sat beside the couch. Dishes were drying beside the sink. A calendar on the wall listed work shifts and scribbled grocery lists. Daniel's eyes moved gently over the room before settling on the girl. Emily, he asked quietly, can I take a look at your arms? Without a word, she pulled up her sleeves. Red blotches marred her skin, angry-looking welts with jagged edges, some scratched open. Daniel knelt to get a closer look, but didn't touch. The irritation looked painful and widespread. Do they hurt? Emily nodded. They itch all the time. Sometimes they burn. Daniel's concern deepened. Has your mom seen them? She gave me cream, but she's always tired. She works a lot. At that moment, Rusty lifted his nose and began sniffing toward the far right corner of the room. Though he moved slowly, he was purposeful, his body tracking something unseen. He stopped near a low shelf stuffed with children's books and toys, ears slightly tilted forward. Daniel watched him, following the line of his nose. What's over there, Emily? She patted across the room and reached into the clutter, pulling out a stuffed bear, gray and a little floppy, with one ear nearly torn off. This is Smokey, she said softly. I sleep with him every night. Rusty sniffed toward the bear again, letting out a low, uncertain whine. His front paw tapped forward as if he could sense something was wrong but couldn't place it. Daniel took a slow breath. Mind if I hold him? She hesitated, then handed the bear over. It felt damp near the seams. A faint odor clung to it. Acrid, chemical, hidden beneath the familiar musk of fabric and child. Daniel didn't need to be a scientist to know something about the toy felt wrong. He looked at Rusty. The dog had sat down now, his head turned just slightly away from the bear. His reaction confirmed the suspicion growing in Daniel's mind. Where did Smokey come from? Daniel asked gently. Emily thought for a second. Mommy brought him home. She said the people at work were throwing stuff out. Just then, the sound of keys jingling echoed from the porch. The front door swung open, and Melissa Carter stepped in, hair soaked, shoulders slumped from another long shift. She looked up with surprise at the scene. her daughter, the officer, and the dog in her living room. "Officer Grayson, is something wrong?" Daniel stood. "I came to check on Emily. She called us this morning, said her skin was hurting." Melissa's face paled. She dropped her purse and hurried over to Emily, brushing the girl's hair back and crouching beside her. "Sweetheart, why didn't you wait for me?" "I got scared," Emily whispered. Daniel held up the bear. "Did you bring this home from work?" Melissa stood slowly. She was in her early 30s, thin, with tired blue eyes and hands reddened by years of chemical cleaners. "Yeah, from the storage room. I figured it was safe. Looked clean enough." "You work at the food plant, right?" She nodded. "On the night cleaning crew. They're clearing out an old wing. Some boxes had old toys, decorations. I thought Emily might like one." Daniel's gaze returned to the bear. "I think it might be the cause. Rusty reacted to it. There's a smell I can't quite place, but I don't like it." Melissa looked stunned. I didn't mean to." "No one's blaming you," Daniel said calmly. "But I'd like to get it checked. Emily's skin is reacting to something, and we need to find out what." Melissa swallowed, then nodded. Rusty shifted again, rising and patting toward Daniel's leg. He pressed against it gently, signaling he was ready to leave if needed. Daniel reached down and gave his head a light rub. Later that evening, as the sky turned a deeper gray and the rain showed no signs of stopping, Josh Grayson sat at the kitchen table in Daniel's house, poking absent-mindedly at a peanut butter sandwich. His hoodie sleeves were pulled over his hands, and his dark hair was damp from earlier when he had taken the trash out without an umbrella. He glanced across the room to where Rusty lay curled in his bed, chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. "He doesn't even see," Josh muttered, half to himself. Daniel, who had just returned and was peeling off his rain-soaked jacket, paused. "But he listens. He feels. That's how he knows when something's wrong." Josh nodded slowly, then got up, walked over, and sat down beside the sleeping dog. He didn't reach out, just sat, eyes watching the rise and fall of Rusty's breath. "Maybe that's better," Josh said after a moment, "not seeing things, just sensing what matters." Daniel looked over from the sink. For once he didn't reply. He just let the silence speak for both of them. The next morning in Fallbrook came with no sunrise, just a persistent gray that settled over the town like a wool blanket. Fog clung to the low fields beyond the Carter home and rolled in wisps between the buildings on Main Street. It smelled faintly of rusted fences, wet corn stalks, and the muddy promise of a storm yet to arrive. The air was thick with silence, the kind that made footsteps sound louder and questions weigh heavier. At the back of the police cruiser, Rusty sat upright, his head tilted slightly out the open window. Though blind, the old German shepherd moved with alertness that made people forget what he couldn't see. His white blindfold was freshly tied, clean and smooth against the dark fur on his face, ears turning slightly with each passing breeze. Daniel Grayson sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the wheel but not starting the engine. He looked at the warehouse in front of him, the east wing of Hollow Creek Food Processing Plant. The building loomed dull and flat in the fog, the steel siding spotted with age and years of condensation. It was here, in a long unused section of the plant, that Melissa Carter had gathered some old decorations and toys. It was here Daniel believed the problem began. "All right, Rusty," he said quietly. "Let's see what you find." The dog jumped down from the seat, paws soft on the pavement, nose already twitching. Daniel followed close behind, boots crunching over the gravel as they approached the side entrance. The door was dented near the bottom, flaking red paint. Melissa had given him a temporary access badge and warned him the place hadn't been cleaned in years. Inside, the hallway was lined with metal lockers and crates pushed up against the walls. The fluorescent lights flickered weakly overhead. The smell hit immediately: musty cardboard, chemical cleaner, and something else faint and synthetic. Rusty moved slowly, nose to the ground. He turned left, then right, tracking the invisible path with every breath. His pace quickened as they moved deeper into the building until he stopped in front of a wide steel door marked Storage C, Retired. Daniel tried the handle. Unlocked. The room beyond was filled with boxes, holiday decorations, faded banners, old uniforms, and bins of unclaimed items. Rusty moved toward the far wall, where a metal shelf sat unevenly against a cracked concrete floor. He circled once, then sniffed near the base of a box, stacked with old fabric and plastic trinkets. Then he whined and backed away. Daniel crouched and opened the box. Inside were several plush toys, cheaply made bears, rabbits, and dogs with thin fabric and clumped stuffing. One had a faint oily sheen to it. Daniel picked it up carefully, and the smell sharpened. Chemical, bitter. His fingers tingled slightly where they touched the seams. He placed the toy in a Ziploc evidence bag and looked down at Rusty. "Good boy," he whispered. The dog sat quietly beside him, his tail brushing the floor in a slow rhythm, satisfied. Daniel returned to his cruiser just as a voice called out from the adjacent stairwell. "Well now, if it isn't Fallbrook's one-man detective unit." Daniel turned to see Carl Benton descending the stairs. The man was in his late 50s, stocky with a round, ruddy face and a thick mustache that twitched with every word. He wore a pressed button-up with the company logo stitched above the chest pocket. His gait was slow and measured, the walk of a man used to being in charge, but who hadn't worked the floor in years. "Morning, Carl," Daniel said flatly. "Melissa told me you were sniffing around," Carl said, eyeing the dog. "No pun intended." Daniel raised the evidence bag. "You know anything about the chemical residue in these? It's likely what's been causing a child's skin reaction." Carl didn't look at the bag. Old storage junk, decorations from who knows when. If it was dangerous, it would have been labeled. Daniel's jaw tightened. "There's no ventilation in there, no disposal logs, no chain of custody." Carl chuckled dryly. "Officer, with all due respect, we process meat and frozen peas. This isn't a science lab." Daniel stepped forward. "A 6-year-old girl is covered in red welts because someone at your plant didn't follow protocol." Carl's smile disappeared. "And you're sure that's our fault? Not some allergy? Or a little too much detergent at home?" Rusty let out a low growl, soft and steady. Daniel didn't raise his voice. "If you're not willing to cooperate, I'll be taking this to the county health department, and maybe beyond." Carl's expression shifted to something colder, then he turned. "Do what you have to do." Daniel watched him disappear up the stairs, then looked down at Rusty. "Come on, let's go do what we do best." Back at home that afternoon, Josh Grayson sat cross-legged on the floor of the living room, a yellow legal pad open in his lap and a pencil tapping against his knee. Rusty lay nearby, napping, his blindfold still on, his ears occasionally flicking at passing sounds. Josh was 17, tall and narrow, with a mop of chestnut hair that often fell into his eyes. He had always been a visual learner, sketching in the margins of homework or filming short videos on his phone. But lately, he'd started thinking about what it meant to capture something you couldn't see. He had followed his dad and Rusty earlier, from a distance, watching how the blind dog moved, nose leading, ears tracking, feet hesitant, but sure. He couldn't shake the image. Now, on his pad, he was writing, "Rusty doesn't chase the world, he feels it first." What if that's how we're supposed to live, not seeing everything, just sensing what's true? He looked over at the dog. "You don't know it," he said softly, "but you're teaching me how to tell stories again." Daniel returned home just as Josh finished the line. The door creaked open, and the scent of damp air followed him in. He looked tired, but there was something focused in his expression. "Josh," he said, setting down his coat, "I think we're close." Josh looked up from the pad. "You mean the toy?" Daniel nodded. "Rusty led me straight to a contaminated stash. I've got samples, but the plant's not going to own up easy." Josh stood and held out the legal pad. "Then maybe we help tell the story, not with cameras, but through Rusty's eyes." Daniel took the pad, reading the lines in silence. Then, for the first time in a long while, he smiled. The next morning, Fallbrook was cloaked in a thick mist, heavy and unmoving, as if the sky itself had decided to descend and sit quietly upon the land. The trees behind the Hollow Creek plant stood ghost-like through the fog, tall and unmoving, their branches slick with dew. Birds didn't sing that morning. Even the air held its breath. Daniel Grayson stood behind the plant's main facility, near a crumbling brick wall that bordered the back lot. Rusty was ahead of him, nose low, tail level, his movements deliberate. The blind German shepherd moved through the weeds and damp earth with a confidence born not from sight, but from memory, scent, and instinct. Daniel watched him closely, scanning the area with narrowed eyes. This part of the property had clearly been forgotten. Old pallets rotting in stacks, half-buried trash bins, and a rusted fence leaning into a collapsed corner of chain link. It wasn't on any map Melissa had given him. She hadn't even known it existed. Rusty's head lifted suddenly. He turned sharply to the right and walked toward a patch of overgrown ground next to the wall. He circled once, twice, then stopped, nose pressed low, ears back. Daniel approached quickly. Rusty began pawing at the ground. It wasn't aggressive, more a steady, careful scraping. Dirt flew lightly behind him, and soon a small patch of fabric peeked through the mud. Rusty paused, then leaned in and bit down gently, lifting something from the earth. It was a stuffed bear. Gray and worn, with one eye missing and a jagged tear along the seam, it was unmistakably Smokey, Emily's missing toy. But this version of Smokey reeked. Even through the dampness, Daniel could smell it. Sharp, acidic, chemical. Rusty whined as he carried the bear toward Daniel. By the time he reached his handler, the skin around his mouth had begun to redden, faint but visible. Daniel knelt immediately, taking the bear from Rusty's jaws and gently wiping the dog's muzzle with his sleeve. "Easy, boy, easy," he whispered. Rusty sat back, licking his lips uncomfortably, eyes unseen, but face filled with unease. Daniel held the bear in both gloved hands. The fabric was soaked with something sticky, and his fingertips began to tingle almost instantly. He dropped the toy into a thick plastic bag and sealed it tight, pressing the air out slowly. This was it. This was the link between the plant's forgotten stockpile and Emily's symptoms, unfiltered physical evidence. By the time Daniel returned to his cruiser, he already knew what he needed to do next. That afternoon, in the Grayson household, Josh sat in front of his laptop, reviewing footage from his handheld camera. He had gone with his dad that morning, watching from a distance as Rusty unearthed the buried bear. He hadn't expected to catch the moment, but he had, and the way Rusty had found the toy, the way his body shifted, slow and precise, told more story than words ever could. Josh had edited the clip down to 45 seconds. It showed Rusty approaching the corner of the yard, digging with measured patience and lifting the toy into his mouth. It ended with Daniel taking the bear and Rusty licking his muzzle as if irritated. There was no dialogue, just the sound of wind and leaves brushing the wall behind them. Josh posted the clip to a small storytelling channel he had started a year ago and abandoned after a few posts. This time, he titled it, "A Blind Dog Finds What No One Else Could See." Within 3 hours, the video had over 12,000 views. By nightfall, it passed 80,000. People commented from all over the country, parents, veterinarians, former K9 handlers. Some called it a miracle. Some called it a call to justice. Others simply called it what it was, proof that some truths don't need sight to be seen. Back at the station, Daniel sat in the small interview room across from a newly arrived woman in her 60s, Dr. Helen Brooks, a toxicologist from the State Environmental Division. She had sharp eyes behind square glasses, a halo of silver hair pulled into a tight bun, and a no-nonsense tone that had likely frightened more than a few bureaucrats in her career. She was holding the bear in its sealed container with latex gloves, eyes narrowed. "You're certain the dog pulled this from company grounds?" she asked. "Right near the foundation wall," Daniel confirmed. "Unmarked zone, no disposal logs." She exhaled through her nose. "I can already smell the organophosphates from here. This was probably used for pest control, maybe a fumigation experiment years ago. If the toy absorbed residue, and then a child kept it in close contact." She didn't finish. Daniel looked at her. "Would it be enough to hold the company accountable?" She glanced up. "For negligence? Absolutely." Daniel nodded. "That's all I needed to hear." Meanwhile, at home, Josh sat curled beside Rusty on the living room rug. The dog lay stretched out, his head resting gently on Josh's knee. The skin around his muzzle had calmed down after a gentle wash, but Josh still looked at him with concern. "You okay?" he whispered. Rusty didn't move, but let out a low, steady exhale. Josh reached for his phone. The view count was still rising. 127,000. He opened a notepad app and started typing. Sometimes, the blind lead us through the dark. Not because they know where we're going, but because they remember how to listen. He saved it as Rusty, Part 2. That night, the local news station called Daniel. By morning, the State Department had sent an official notice to Hollow Creek. And Rusty, blind but never lost, had become the most trusted nose in Iowa. Fallbrook awoke to a blue sky for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. The clouds had cleared overnight, leaving behind a crispness in the air that seemed to wipe the slate clean. Sunlight glittered off rain-drenched cornfields, and the smell of cut hay and damp wood filtered through the town like a quiet hymn. Fall had finally arrived, not with a chill, but with relief. In a modest hospital room at the north edge of town, 6-year-old Emily Carter sat cross-legged on the bed, humming softly while brushing the fur of a brand-new stuffed bear. Her arms were wrapped in gauze, but the red blotches that once caused her so much pain had faded to faint pink trails. She looked stronger now, still small, still delicate, but with light back in her eyes. Beside her sat Melissa Carter, her dark brown hair tied back into a loose ponytail, a change of clean clothes replacing her usual stained work uniform. Her face was still tired, but today it was tired with hope. She held a folder in her lap, her thumb running over the words printed across the front. Legal Aid of Iowa, Family Relief Program. Across from them sat Ellen Starks, a community outreach lawyer in her mid-40s, with sharp cheekbones, warm eyes, and hands that moved constantly when she talked. Ellen had been with the nonprofit for 15 years. She'd grown up in Cedar Rapids and came from a long line of farmhands and factory workers. Her passion wasn't loud, but it burned hot, especially when it came to kids. "We've filed the formal complaint," Ellen said, tapping the folder, "with the Department of Public Health and the Labor Board. The evidence Officer Grayson collected, and that video your son shared, have turned this into something bigger than just Emily's case. Hollow Creek's going to be held responsible." Melissa swallowed hard. "I didn't know. I didn't mean—" "You didn't do anything wrong," Ellen interrupted softly. "You brought home a toy for your child. That doesn't make you a criminal. It makes you a mom." Across the room, the door creaked open. Daniel Grayson stepped in, dressed in his uniform, the badge on his chest glinting in the sunlight. And beside him, calm, quiet, ever ready, was Rusty. The blind German shepherd walked slowly but surely beside Daniel, his white blindfold still tied, though now it bore a tiny red heart embroidered just above his brow, sewn by one of the hospital nurses. Emily lit up. "Rusty?" The dog turned his head toward the voice and wagged his tail once, gently. Daniel smiled. "He's got someone he's missed." Emily slid off the bed and crouched on the floor, letting Rusty come to her. She wrapped her arms around his neck, careful not to press too tight. The dog rested his chin on her knee and stayed there, perfectly still. Daniel turned to Melissa and Ellen. "Discharge papers are ready. She's free to go." Later that week, Fallbrook Elementary held its first school assembly of the season. The gym was packed. Folding chairs lined the bleachers, parents filled the back wall, and kids fidgeted in rows on the floor, chattering quietly. On stage stood a podium, and beside it, a display board featuring photos of Rusty, digging, sniffing, curled up on the police station floor. The projector played a muted loop of Josh's now viral video. It had surpassed 2 million views. Principal Diane Avery stood to one side of the stage. In her early 60s, with snow-white hair pulled into a tight bun and a voice as commanding as it was kind, she addressed the crowd with the ease of someone who'd guided generations of Fallbrook kids through both spelling bees and storms. "Today," she said, "we are proud to recognize not only a moment of bravery, but the return of a voice we've missed for far too long." From the side steps, Josh Grayson emerged. He stood tall in his second-hand jeans and black hoodie, his chestnut hair combed back for once. In his hand, he held not his phone, but a single note card. He approached the microphone. He didn't tremble. "My name is Josh Grayson," he began, his voice steady. "Some of you know me. Most of you don't." A few chuckles from the students. He smiled, just a little. "I stopped talking in class a few years ago, not because I didn't have things to say, but because I didn't think anyone would care enough to listen. He paused, looked out at the crowd. His eyes found his father, standing in uniform at the back. Then he looked down at Rusty, lying patiently in front of the stage, head raised, blindfold in place. But someone did listen, even though he couldn't see me, even though he'd never heard my voice. A dog named Rusty showed me what it means to pay attention, not with your eyes, but with your heart. A quiet stillness fell over the room. He led my dad through the dark. He protected a little girl from something no one could see. And somehow, he brought our family back to each other. So today, I want to thank him. He stepped back from the mic. A long silence. Then the crowd stood. Applause thundered through the gym. Josh didn't cry, but Daniel, in the back, had to press the edge of his palm to one eye. Outside, as the assembly ended, kids poured into the yard. Laughter echoed between trees. Sunlight filtered through the branches, and the first leaves of October twirled down like confetti. Emily stood barefoot in the edge of the cornfield, arms stretched wide, the wind tugging at the white scarf she now wore like a cape. On its corner, a red heart, just like Rusty's. Ahead of her, Rusty padded through the stalks slowly, tail swaying, the sun warming his back. He didn't need to see where he was going. Emily ran after him, her laughter high and light, the scarf flying behind her like a flag of something finally made right. Sometimes God sends us answers not through thunder or lightning, but through quiet acts of loyalty and love. A blind dog named Rusty didn't need eyes to see the truth. He needed only a heart willing to feel, and the courage to lead others through the dark. In a world that often overlooks the small and the silent, this story reminds us that miracles come in unexpected forms, that healing doesn't always begin in hospitals, but in trust, in family, and in faith. If you believe that God still works through the quiet, through animals, through children, through those who walk by faith and not by sight, then this story is for you. May Rusty's journey remind us to slow down, to listen deeper, and to protect those who cannot protect themselves. May it remind us that no act of love is ever wasted, and no heart that listens ever walks alone. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe in the quiet miracles God still sends, write Amen in the comments. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories of faith, courage, and compassion. And may the Lord bless and protect everyone who watches this video.